Always the latest news and views. You're listening to the Montreal Now podcast with Aaron Rand.
So here's the deal. There's a new study of Quebecers' eating habits, and the picture it paints, I can say, I think, is not a very pretty one. It collected information from nearly 7,000 participants, which means about 26,000 meals. That is the biggest, by the way, project of its kind ever in the province of Quebec. And I thought you need to hear what we found because, as I said, the news is not necessarily very good, which is, one of those things where we've been talking for so long about how you should eat, what you should cut back on, etc. It does not seem like the message here, at least in one particular item, has gotten through. Benoît Lamarche is scientific director of the University of Laval's Nutrition Center. I spoke to him earlier this afternoon and asked him to kind of give us the details.
Well, as you mentioned, this is a survey based on a lot of people throughout Quebec, so this is really unique data, and for the first time in a very long time, we have detailed analysis of what the Quebecers are eating. Vast majority of people, 80% plus, consume too much salt and saturated fat. About 64% don't meet the recommendation from fruits and vegetables, 5 per day. So it can be a pessimistic perspective on our dietary habits, but it's actually not worse or better than what we see elsewhere in other provinces, for example, or in the U.S. But we do have important challenges from a population perspective in terms of how we eat and what we eat.
So when I first saw this, the thing I heard was salt and sugar, and we know those are the two things, of course, we've been told to watch for. But it turns out here, it was a bit of a surprise to me, but maybe in a good way, the sugar not so much as concerned as it used to be perhaps, but salt, that is your biggest finding here that is of concern, right?
Yes. So it's a very good point because we do hear a lot about sugar. And so if you rank our challenges in terms of diet, salt is way above sugar. I was saying more than 80% exceed the recommended amount of salt. For sugar, it's 40%, so it's half the number of excess sodium intake. So that's a relatively good news, I would say. And then it like these kind of data enlighten us on where we should look to intervene or to have policies to help people achieve healthier diets. And for sure, addressing the sodium issue should be a key factor here.
Yeah, I will tell you what really struck me here, and I wonder how many people will find this a bit interesting. One of the items on exceeding your sodium limits here, or the recommended limits, came in the way of bread.
Yes. So it's again, these data are just revealing things we kind of expected or knew, but not to that extent. The top 3 foods that are in the place of Quebecers, as we did our survey, contributing to sodium intake was the sauces, the condiments that we add to our recipes or to our foods, the breads and the cheese. And this accounted for 50% of the sodium intake in the plate of Quebecers. So yes, the bread is kind of a surprise because you don't expect necessarily that's a salty food, but there is a lot of salt in packaged breads. And because we eat a lot of bread, that becomes a significant source of sodium in our diet. So this is, we identify this issue, this challenge, and therefore we have targets for intervention. And the magnifier that we see now on packaged foods, including packaged bread, help us identify the high salt bread. And there are some low salt bread, so people can actually choose the lower salt bread based on this information, and that's a good thing.
I would ask, though, when we put bread in sort of a general category, we're talking about, you buy a packaged white bread in a supermarket, but there are, bakeries baking breads fresh that you'd think are better. Is there a difference?
Actually, yes, we can generalize, of course, to every bakery and every bread and like I said, there's some packaged breads that have lower salt content, and you can identify those using the magnifiers on sodium. But yes, the bakery breads are generally lower in salt, and but they last. That's why there's salt in bread. They last less for a shorter period of time on the shelves. So you have to eat them more rapidly. But there's certainly lower salt in general in freshly baked bread. as opposed to full packaged breads on the shelves.
So I know, and I think most consumers seem to have gotten the message about sugar, and you should be paying attention to how much you take. I mean, to the point where you're looking at, the dietary breakdown on the back of something you bought as a processed food to see how many grams of sugar it contains. I know I do that. What do you do? What's the sort of the guideline as far as sodium goes?
Well, sodium is a big problem. First, there's a lot of people exceeding the recommendation for sodium, and that's partly because sodium is everywhere. So it's really hard to keep track of what our sodium consumption is. There's some sodium in cereals as well, breakfast cereals. There's sodium, like I said, in sauces. Cheese, it's a natural nutrient in cheese, so you can't really take it out of the cheese. And then there's, so it's coming from so many different foods. And so it's really challenging for us as eaters, as consumers, to try to be aware of that. And we hope that strategies like identifying the foods that are high in sodium that exceed a particular cutoff for one serving, using the magnifier on the packaged food, will help the industry and kind of quote-unquote force the industry to reformulate products so that they are lower in sodium, sugar, and fat, saturated fat, so that they become healthier, quote-unquote, as well.
Yeah, and I would guess this is, again, one of those ideas, right, when we talk about healthier eating, whatever processed, ultra-processed foods, clearly the indication is stay away because they would contain even more sodium.
Yeah, I mean, we're currently doing this analysis. This is probably going to be the next report that you will see is the proportion of calories that come from ultra-processed food in Quebec. We know it's probably above 40%, so it's a lot. And these foods, although they contain additives and are formulated in a special way for us to appreciate these foods, they are also major sources, if you combine them all together, of sodium, saturated fat, and sugar. So the idea is not to stay away at all from all these foods, but it's to be aware that we should limit consumption and leave more space for healthier foods in our plates, like whole grain foods or fruits and vegetables, for example.
Let's talk about that, because when it comes to fruits and vegetables, we've been hearing this message for a long time. We should eat more fruits and vegetables. It does not seem that message is getting through according to your study either, does it?
Well, we're certainly there's like I said, like 36% of the Quebecers achieving the 5 or more servings per day of fruits and vegetables. So that's on the low side. Because we don't have data before, it's hard to say whether it's moving up or down, but it's certainly on the low side. Eating fruits and vegetables is a challenge for a lot of people, considering the cost of these foods nowadays, right. Availability in some areas, in remote areas. So because we're measuring the whole Quebec population, we capture some of these challenges. And there's also the question of culture. Thankfully, although we don't consume enough, some of the fruits and vegetables we consume are locally grown. Apple is prominent, small fruits like blueberries and strawberries, and then onions, tomatoes, and carrots. So that's a kind of a good news because we're attached to local foods. We see them in the plates of Quebecers. And so if we want to increase the amount of fruits and vegetables in the plates of Quebecers, we can do that using these foods that are appreciated and that we already found in the plates of Quebecers.
So just as a final question, given all this information, this research, the size of the study itself, I mean, where do we go from here? What's the next step?
So we're initially funded by the government of Quebec. So our intent and our objective is to inform the policies and to measure the effect of interventions that are being implemented in communities and nationwide in the province. And so the idea is to be able to get the best data possible to see, okay, where should we look? What should we look for in terms of the next intervention? We see that sodium is a major problem as opposed perhaps to free sugar. So this is a good example where this would inform policies and say, let's try to hit the right nails and not try to shoot for everything. We're looking at questions like inequities in health and things like that. So this is really an informative project that will drive, hopefully, policy decisions in the coming years in Quebec.
We will leave it at that. Monsieur Lamarche, thanks so much for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation.
Hello, Canada.
This is Bryan Adams Radio.
Hosted by Bryan Adams himself.
We'll play a few of mine, a ton of my favorites, and some must-hear behind-the-scenes stories from the world of rock and roll. One thing about doing rock and roll so long is you end up meeting a lot of the people that you admire. Sometimes you even get to work with them.
It's only love, and that's all. Bryan Adams Radio. I'm coming back to you. Now available on the free iHeartRadio app.
Hey everybody, how are you tonight? Sounds great.
Staying up to date on your schedule. This is the Montreal Now podcast with Aaron Rand.
So this is a great op-ed, and I wanted to follow up on this because maybe there's some parents out there who feel exactly the same way. So AI is here. We appreciate that, whether you like it or not, right? But subjecting your children to it, well, that's a different story, at least for our next guest, who wrote an op-ed arguing that as far as her children are concerned, AI is not wanted or needed. Katherine Martinko is author of Childhood Unplugged, Practical Advice to Get Kids Off Screens and Find Balance, and is on the line. Thank you so much for being here. So let me begin by how you came to this decision, which I understand starts with you overhearing your teenage son. So walk us through that.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for having me. So I have 3 sons, and 2 of them were discussing using ChatGPT to make flashcards to study for an exam. And they were saying how this was such a great shortcut. You just fed all the notes right into the AI, and it would spit out the flashcards for you, and you'd be 50% of the way along the studying that had to be done. But I, of course, had a negative reaction to this because, as I explained to them, going through your notes and determining what is worth putting on a flashcard for studying is, half the job right there. And they were sort of depriving themselves of the opportunity to review a lot of this content. So I was just upset that one of their teachers had actually suggested this as a good use of AI in this particular situation. And, while it might be for some adults in, certain circumstances, it's certainly not something that I think is benefiting my kids in terms of them retaining academic content from class.
Let me go back then and ask, when you said this to your kids, what was their reaction?
Well, they pushed back. They said that they'd heard otherwise from their teacher, and they thought that just having the flashcards in hand was the end goal. But I had to explain to them that the process of processing the information and retaining it and regurgitating it and writing it down by hand, all of these acts of working your way through that material is
right.
What helps it stick in your mind. So it took a little bit of convincing, but eventually they came around and admitted that I was right.
I wonder, though, at that point, does it then go back to the school and say, why are you suggesting to our children that they go ahead and do this for the point you just mentioned?
Well, it certainly is worth a conversation with their teachers. I do think that a lot of teachers are being encouraged to teach, digital literacy or AI literacy. This is a common theme in our education system. And it is something that I tend to push back on. I have nothing against learning how to use technology. I think kids can have computer skills, but I don't think that every skill needs to be taught through a computer or rely on AI. I think that there's a time and place for that, and I think it comes later in life after our children have had a chance to develop some of the foundational cognitive skills that they need in order to be able to think creatively.
Yeah, beyond cognitive skills, you also point out, and this comes up a lot too, right? Young people are wired for social engagement. So when you say that, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so teenagers obviously need to, younger kids too, but especially adolescents really gravitate to spending time with their peers, and historically they spent a lot of time with their peers in person. But now a lot of those social interactions are moving into online environments, and that's where most of the kids are connecting. And that is something that I consider to be quite tragic. We've obviously seen the fallout from that happening in social media, and now it's happening in AI, where kids are relying on chatbots or characters, as they call them, in order to forge friendships and relationships. The problem is that while these AIs might offer the simulation of a connection or a friend who can talk to you about things, they're not real relationships. These are just robots. And so kids miss out on feeling a lot of those really high-quality aspects of getting to know someone well. So trusting someone and having a sense of commitment, of vulnerability, of mutual effort, all of these things that are really important in a real human relationship. And ultimately, they end up lonelier than ever.
You have a great quote, which is, the most rewarding things in life are born of drudgery and struggle.
Yeah, I think that, when people talk about AI, one of the most common explanations they use for this technology is that it makes things easier. And I feel like that's kind of a silly thing to be trying to do when it comes to our children's education. Why do we want to make things easier for them? We want them to learn. We want them to know how hard it is to stick to a task and then how rewarding it feels to get to the other side and have that really wonderful sense of accomplishment that comes from achieving something.
Yeah, you also have a great note in here, and you can talk about this if you want socially. You can talk about it, psychologically. But you look at real hard numbers. There's a great quote. You say teens, and you did a couple of studies, or you found a couple. Teens in 2003 spent 12 hours a week hanging out with friends. Now in 2024, that's dropped to 5.
I know. It's quite shocking when you look at some of these statistics, how there's been a significant regression, a retreat from the real world on the part of teenagers in particular. And it's because they feel like they're getting some of those needs satisfied through social media platforms and now more and more through AI, chatbots and whatnot. But the quality of the relationship just isn't there. And I truly think that we as parents and guardians and caregivers are depriving our kids of opportunities to be able to forge those meaningful relationships if it's just happening online.
By the way, one last thing, because I thought this was just as great. You also wrote, it found that 80% of high school seniors in 2000 went on dates. 80%. That number now is 46%. So all this, lends credence to your argument that this is not real and that kids are missing out by doing this. But my other question, I guess I got to wrap up, is you're not against all social media sites for kids, right? It's pick and choose?
I'm against social media for kids under the age of 16.
Okay.
So I do think that we should be waiting until that age, just like Australia did. They banned access to social media until the age of 16. I think that in the years leading up to that, we really need to be prioritizing in-person interactions, real, experiences out in the real world, lots of outdoor play, lots of boredom and creativity and physical activity for our kids. There will come a time when they have technology in their lives, no doubt, but I don't think that we need to rush it along as parents.
Good for you. I wonder how many people are going out there. Yeah, you go. Katherine Martinko, thank you so much. Appreciate the time.
Thanks. It was my pleasure.
All right.
The information and the interesting talk to follow. This is the Montreal Now podcast with Aaron Rand.
Seal Test. Yeah, just rolled out a new product, a new milk. 6% milk. Not 2, not skim, not 3, 3.5, 3.8, 6% milk fat. I love how they describe it. This is Seal Test's own wording, right? Naturally rich and smooth, Seal Test 6% is crafted to satisfy and delight every palate. It brings both versatility and quality to the kitchen. Discover the pure, delicious taste of high-fat milk, offering a luxuriously creamy texture, unquote. Kim Arrey is a registered dietitian and nutritionist and is on the line. Kim, thanks so much for coming on today. I think most people's first reaction to this would be, wait a sec, what? I thought the whole idea was we recognized we want to put a limit on these kinds of fatty things. But then again, I know Robert F. Kennedy, U.S., right? The whole idea now is let's go back to high-fat milk. What do you think of this?
Well, my first reaction was kind of like yours, which is like, oh my, why? And apparently there could be a lot of reasons, but nutrition is probably not the highest one on the list. I'm not a real fan, but nutritionally I'm not a fan, but it's okay. There's a lot of things I'm not a fan of as a dietitian that other people like to include, and we have to find a way to do it. Apparently, South Asian population find this type of milk really popular, and apparently it's really good in some recipes, makes great yogurt, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So maybe it's a good idea for specific population, specific foods.
Okay. I heard that, South Asian thing as well, and I thought, okay, if that's part of the diet you had and you come here, now you can no longer find that. I'm like, that's not really far off where cream is at 10%.
No, but cream is only fat, and so it doesn't bring any of the nutrients. This does have milk, this is milk, so you're still getting the protein, you're still getting the carbohydrate, you're still getting the vitamin D, that kind of thing, which you're not going to get from the cream. You're still getting your riboflavin, your B12, which you're not going to get as much from your cream. You're basically just getting fat from the cream. So there's a huge difference, even though the fat content is not that different.
Okay, so again, with respect to, you're not drinking this necessarily every day, although maybe, as you said, some people in their diets were used to this, where they happen to be from. Would you sort of advise against this? I mean, you're reading this story and you're thinking, well, if it's good enough, for some people, maybe I should give this a try. So you're saying you can't recommend it from a nutritional point of view, but can you have this every now and then? If you're drinking regular milk anyway, what would be wrong with this?
Well, so the biggest issue is we're concerned that the amount of saturated fat in your diet will increase your risk of heart disease. Now, we know we have a lot of studies. There was a big review article that was published last year, or 2 years ago, rather, and it was talking about the fat in cheese and fermented milk products, so cheese, kefir, and that kind of thing. And even when you're having full-fat cheeses and kefir, it seems actually have a positive outlook. If we look at all-cause mortality, the more cheese and yogurt you're eating, the lower your all-cause mortality is. So, but we don't think it's quite the same for milk because the matrix is a little bit different. So my thing is, if you want to have this regularly, then I have to look at where else are you getting saturated fat in your diet from, and are you willing to make a compromise on that? Are we able to come and reach a deal that, okay, well, I'm not going to be eating any meat anymore, so I can have high-fat milk, and I'll get my saturated fat from the milk, and I'm only going to have, lentils and chickpeas and that kind of stuff to get my protein. And that, if that works for you, then that's fine. But if you say, no, I also want to eat meat and I also want to have all these other foods that have a lot of saturated fat, then I get a little concerned. Okay,
so this is really kind of a find a middle ground sort of routine, right?
That's what you do with everybody's diet, right? Is we always have to find a middle ground, a way to meet the recommendations and a way to make you happy, get your taste buds happy, right? Because that's really what we try to do for all our clients.
Sure, because that becomes consistency and that's the easiest thing to maintain.
Exactly.
Okay. So I would ask, I mentioned Robert F. Kennedy, right? We had a whole thing on the food chart that came out a couple of months ago. What do you think about this whole idea that we need more meat and dairy in our plates?
I don't understand where they're coming from at all. We're looking at all the data that we've had over the last 40 years at least that is saying the exact opposite. When we look at the longest living populations in the world, the populations in the blue zones, they're not eating more meat. They may be eating it more well divided during the day. But they're not eating more meat, and they're not drinking or eating more dairy than we are. It might be divided differently, but all the studies we have show that a more plant-based diet is going to help you to live longer, healthier life. So it doesn't make any sense that now we're saying, no, eat more meat and have more dairy, and what about the plants and those other things? There's no mention of that, or not a lot.
The problem is people will hear something like that or see something like that and decide, well, if it's coming from, that source, then maybe it's worth a try. But as you just said, there's no basis in fact for this. So it's kind of hard to imagine why this is happening, I guess. Right?
It is, but, I see a lot of people who do what I call a leap of faith science that are attracting a large following. And I think it is true that some people in our populations, for example, seniors, need to focus on their protein intake because they tend not to eat enough protein. But we don't tend to have that happening in other groups of the population. We do have a lot of people who are getting a lot of their nutrition. We've got studies saying that young children or young adolescents are getting 50 to 60% of their calories from ultra-processed foods. And I wish I could say it was at least, something that had protein in it and maybe some breading on it or something. But a lot of it is just from chips and candy and stuff that doesn't have a lot of nutritional value. So yes, we have to make sure they do get their protein. But I don't think we have to eat more than the current daily or the previous recommendations. I think we just have to remember to actually meet those recommendations.
We will leave it at that. Kim, very much appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
This May, iHeartRadio celebrates Asian Heritage Month. Discover powerful stories, vibrant cultures, and unforgettable music. From inspiring podcasts to playlists that span East, South, Southeast, and West Asian artists. We're honoring the voices shaping our world. Listen now on the free iHeartRadio app and at iHeartRadio.ca. your city, at your leisure. This is the Montreal Now podcast with Aaron Rand.
Story this morning in the Montreal Gazette, which kind of caught my eye. It concerns a gentleman by the name of Professor at Concordia, at least he was, named Saad, who's decided, you know what, I had enough of Montreal, had enough of Canada. I'm moving to the U.S. And happy to do so. So Saad is on the line. Professor, thank you for being with us. Let me begin by, first of all, a little bit of context here. You were at Concordia for how many years?
32 years. I joined straight out of my PhD in 1994.
Okay, and all of a sudden now, this decision you made didn't happen all of a sudden, but why have you decided to walk and leave, and not only leave Concordia, people do, but move full-time to the U.S.? What brought this on?
Several reasons. First, and I'm not just trying to be courteous here, I'm being truthful. I've had a wonderful career at Concordia. They've given me all of the freedoms that one could hope for as a professor to pursue any research that I wanted, to write about whatever I wanted. But number one, even though I've been in Canada since the 1970s, we're originally from Lebanon, I've never acclimatized to the weather here. And as I get older, I'm even less open to, facing the dreadful winter. So that was number one. Number two, I'm not a huge fan of the Quebec and Canadian governments taking most of the labor of my mind as parasitic taxation. If I can go to a place where I pay astoundingly lesser taxes, it's certainly going to help my future and that of my family. Weather, parasitic taxation, and a great opportunity at the University of Mississippi said that it was time for me to go to the next chapter of my life. Okay, so let me go back to something else, because maybe I've kind of gotten this wrong. You have been a very vocal critic of policies under Justin Trudeau, specifically with respect to transgender rights, et cetera. Your book, by the way, you have a book called Suicidal Empathy. How long has this been out? Suicidal Empathy came out exactly a week ago, and it's been number one in Canada across all books for much of the past week. Okay, so in that book, correct me if I'm wrong, you basically argue that Canada, you say under Justin Trudeau, is one of the clearest examples of, for all intents and purposes, suicidal empathy in the world. Can you explain what that means to you? What is suicidal empathy? Right. Thank you for that question. Look, empathy is a wonderful virtue to possess. We are a social species, so it makes sense for you and I, Aaron, if we wish to have a meaningful conversation, I need to put myself in your mind and vice versa. So empathy is wonderful. But like most things in life, it has to be well modulated. Aristotle explained to us several thousand years ago that too little of something is not good, too much of something is not good, and that also applies for empathy. If you have no empathy, you're a psychopath. But if you have hyperactive empathy that is invoked in the wrong situations toward the wrong targets, you end up with suicidal empathy. So you argue that those wrong targets are which ones? Caring more about illegal immigrants than you care about American vets, caring more about Mother Earth than reproducing, because to reproduce would mean that you are increasing carbon footprints, caring more about women with penises than you care about biological women, and there are countless other such examples would be, here's another one, caring more about recidivist felons than about their victims. All of these examples stem from dysregulated empathy. Okay, that's one very giant pot of a lot of things that, you're saying we are overly, or as you just said, hyper empathetic about. If we go back to 2017, which is, I think, what brought you into the spotlight, if I've read this correctly, you were opposed to Bill C-16 that was introduced back then. That's the legislation that added gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act. That was under a government then that's no longer in power. Has there been a change? Has the one that you've noticed that would have changed your mind on this or not? Unfortunately, it hasn't. That's another reason why I thought it was maybe time for me to go and pursue my professorial career elsewhere. Canada is fully parasitized by suicidal empathy. And let me give a concrete example from academia. Last year, the University of Waterloo, which is the equivalent of Caltech or MIT in the U.S., right? A very strong STEM university with very strong engineering and computer science background, put out 2 calls for Canada Research Chairs, which are the highest professorships that the Canadian government endows. And they were looking for 2 types of artificial intelligence professor. For one of the calls, the professor that could apply had to be transgender, non-binary, gender fluid, or two-spirit. That's probably not the best way to organize science.
You're kind of making the DEI argument in the U.S., right, in a sense, by saying that?
I am. Diversity and inclusion and equity is a cancer to the dignity of meritocracy. That doesn't mean that if people do not start with equal opportunities, we don't correct that. There was a time when women were not allowed on university campuses, and we fixed that. We actually now have a preponderance of women in university campuses. So I'm not suggesting that there aren't at times institutional barriers. There are, but to argue that we are going to be adjudicating academic excellence that keeps a country competitive within the intellectual landscape based on whether I'm non-binary or two-spirit is probably, again, not the best way to organize science.
So, as I hear you say that, I think to myself, where do you draw that line? You brought up a wonderful example, right, of women who had been in the past held back. So we recognize that. We say, okay, let's fix that. We did. Why can't the line be expanded to accommodate other people?
Well, it depends what the accommodation looks like. So, for example, if you now start arguing that the scientific method is only one way of knowing, but there are alternative but equally valid ways of knowing because you want to elevate indigenous voices, that is not a good idea, right? There is a way for us to ensure that we live in a fair society without murdering truth, right? There is no, I'm Lebanese Jewish. There is no Lebanese Jewish way of doing evolutionary psychology. There's only evolutionary psychology. The scientific method frees us from the shackles of our personal identities. So yes, there is a place for the government to intervene and help people who have been structurally marginalized, but that doesn't mean that we create a new ethos within the university where we decolonize and indigenize science.
Well, so to that point, you said structurally marginalized. If you deal with indigenous people in this country who have been structurally marginalized and continue to be, what would be the solution to allow those people to be able to fill some of those jobs, professorships, et cetera, in your mind?
Give them equality of opportunities. I came within my lifetime. This is not going back 250 years ago when there was a battle between the Iroquois and French Canada. I came from an imminent execution in Lebanon. My parents were kidnapped by Fatah and tortured. My grandparents escaped Syria. My brother-in-law's family escaped Alexandria. So I don't have to invoke intergenerational trauma. It's the trauma of my childhood. We came to Canada with nothing. Canada was kind enough to accept us, but we had the dignity to pull up our shirts and say, we will take it from here, and here I am talking to you on the radio. So victimhood might be part of your heritage, and that's perfectly fine. But what defines your dignity is that you overcome it.
I would ask you, because we're going to run out of time, this idea then, so you've been in Canada for, you said, more than 30 years. Yes. You look back at the time you spent here. This is the country that educated you, employed you for 3 decades, gave you a platform that you've now become internationally known for. Is there no gratitude here? I mean, why not simply stay here and try to make the system better?
There is infinite gratitude, but how far does my gratitude go? I'm not a free individual that can exercise. Once you accept me in, I'm bound to be a prisoner to this country. There is no such thing as free market. If another society says, we want to welcome you and we're not going to steal 60% of your income, I don't have the dignity to do that. Aaron, I've had to walk around with protection because of the positions that I've taken precisely to protect Canadian values. I think I've done my dues, and maybe it's time for people to say, thank you for your services and best of luck down south.
Protection from what? So when you say you've had to walk around with protection, what was that attack or perceived attack on you?
Well, you can pick a long list of potential threats, but when you, for example, are a high-profile Jewish professor who comes out in defense of Jewish causes and of Israel, it might not go very well for you.
But there have been others subject to the same thing. That's sadly the world we're living in right now. I imagine that will change at some point as well, but that's not the reason you're leaving.
I mean, there are certain realities in Montreal that have made it a bit less friendly for people with my religious heritage. I can tell you that in the south where I'm moving to, there are a lot of lesser threats. I was once, by the way, threatened, death threat, while walking with my then 10-year-old son. When I went to see the police and detectives were placed on that particular case, they told me, well, maybe you shouldn't be talking about such things. And in any case, if he comes back again, then just call 911, because I don't have the personal agency to actually carry an arm to protect myself.
Right.
Because when the guy is trying to come and knife me, I'm sure that he'll stop and I'll say to him, please, wait a second. Let me call 911.
Okay, I get it.
And only after that, knife me.
Okay, I have to wrap up. I just want to go to one quote that you did say, and just explain this and we'll wrap this up. You wrote, "My inner spirit is American." What does that mean?
I believe in complete personal freedom, and therefore, to that extent, entrepreneurial meritocracy, can-do attitude is much more aligned in that sense with the U.S. than it is with Canada, and that does not take away the fact that I love Canada and will always honor it.
Okay, we will leave it at that. I wish you the best, and I thank you for the time. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Listen live to Montreal Now with Aaron Rand. Weekdays from 2 until 6. Miss something? Find on-demand highlights at CJAD800.com or on the free iHeartRadio app.
I'm Luke Wilson. Join me each week for Film Never Lies. Since retiring from the NFL, I've had a lot on my mind, and now I've got my own show. So if you're tired of lazy takes, if you want honest conversations, join us each week. Film Never Lies, available on all TSN platforms and the iHeartRadio app.